The earliest experience of art must have been that it was incantatory, magical. Art was an instrument of ritual. See the paintings in the caves at the Lascaux, Altamira, Pasiego, Niu, etc. The earliest theory of art, that of the Greek philosophers, proposed that art was mimesis, an imitation of reality. It's at this point that the peculiar question of the value of art arose, for the mimetic theory, by its very terms, challenges art to justify itself. Plato, who proposed the theory, seems to have done so in order to rule that the value of art is dubious, since he considered ordinary material things as themselves mimetic objects, imitations of transcendent forms or structures. Even the best painting of a bed would only be an imitation of an imitation. For Plato, art was not particularly valuable. The painting of a bed is no good to sleep on, nor in the strict sense true. And Aristotle's arguments in defense of art do not really challenge Plato's view that all art is an elaborate tranquille and therefore a lie. But he does dispute that art is useless. Lie or no, art has a certain value according to Aristotle in that it is a form of therapy. Art is useful after all, Aristotle counters, medicinally useful in that it arouses and purges dangerous emotions. In Plato and Aristotle, the mimetic theory of art goes hand in hand with the assumption that art is always figurative. But advocates of the mimetic theory need not close their eyes to decorative and abstract art. The fallacy that all art is necessarily a realism can be modified or scrapped without ever moving outside the problems delimited by the mimetic theory. The fact is that all Western consciousness of and reflection upon art have remained within the confines staked out by the Greek theory of art as mimesis or representation. It's through this theory that art as such, above and beyond given works of art, becomes problematic, in need of a defense. And it's the defense of art that gives birth to the odd vision by which something we've learned to call form is separated off from something we've learned to call content, and to the well-intentioned move which makes content essential and form accessory. Even in modern times, when most artists and critics have discarded the idea of art as a representation of some outer reality in favour of the theory of art as subjective expression, the main feature of the mimetic theory persists. Whether we conceive of the work of art on the model of a picture, art as a picture of reality, or on the model of a statement, art as the statement of the artist, content still comes first. The content may have changed, may now be less figurative, less lucidly realistic, but it is still assumed that a work of art is its content, or, as it's usually put today, that a work of art by definition says something. What X is saying is, what X is trying to say is, what my X said was, etc., etc. None of us can ever retrieve that innocence before all theory when art knew no need to justify itself. When one didn't ask the work of art what it said because one knew, or thought one knew, what it did. From now until the end of conscious, we are stuck with the task of defending art. We may only quarrel with one another any means of defence. Indeed, we have an obligation to overthrow any means of defending art which becomes particularly obtuse or onerous or insensitive to contemporary needs and practice. This is the case today, with the very idea of content itself. Whatever it may have been in the past, the idea of content today is mainly a hindrance, a nuisance, a subtle or not so subtle philistinism. Though the actual developments in many arts may be leading us away from the idea that a work of art is primarily its content, this idea still exerts an extraordinary hegemony. I want to suggest that this is because the idea is now perpetuated within the guise of a certain way of encountering works of art thoroughly ingrained in most people who take any of the arts seriously. What the idea on the overemphasis of content entails is the perennial, never consummated project of interpretation. And conversely, it's the habit of approaching works of art in order to interpret them that sustains the fancy that there really is such a thing as the content of a work of art. Of course, I don't mean interpretation in the broadest sense, the sense in which Nietzsche rightly says there are no facts, only interpretations. By interpretation, I mean here a conscious act of the mind, which illustrates a certain code, certain rules of interpretation. Directed to art, interpretation means plucking a set of elements, the X, the Y, the Z, and so forth, from the whole work. The task of interpretation is virtually one of translation. The interpreter says, look, don't you see that X is or really means A? That Y is really B, that Z is really C. What situation could prompt such a curious project for transforming a text? History gives us the material for an answer. Interpretation first appeared in the culture of late classical antiquity, when the power and credibility of myths had been broken by the realistic view of the world introduced by scientific enlightenment. Once the question that haunts the post-mythic conscious, that of the seeminess of religious symbols, had been asked, the ancient texts were in their pristine form no longer acceptable. Then interpretation was summoned to reconcile the old text with modern demands. Thus the Stoics, to accord with their view that the gods must be moral, allegorized away the rude features of Zeus and his boisterous clan in Homer's epics. What Homer really designated by the adultery of Zeus and later they explained was the union between power and wisdom. In the same vein, Philo of Alexandria interpreted the literal historical narratives of the Hebrew Bible as spiritual paradigms. Story of the Exodus from Egypt, wandering in the desert for 40 years, the entry into the Promised Land, Philo, was really just an allegory of the individual soul's emancipation, tribulations, and final deliverance. Thus, interpretation presupposes a discrepancy between the clear meaning of the text and the demands of later readers. It seeks to resolve that discrepancy. The situation is that for some reason a text has become unacceptable, yet it cannot be discarded. Interpretation is a radical strategy for conserving an old text which is thought too precious to repudiate by revamping it. The interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering it. But he can't admit to doing this. He claims to be only making it intelligible, by disclosing its true meaning. However far the interpreters go in altering the text, another notorious example are the rabbinic and Christian spiritual interpretations of the clearly erotic Song of Songs. They must be claiming to be reading off a sense which is already there. Interpretation in our own time, however, is even more complex. For the contemporary zeal for interpretation is prompted often not by a piety toward the troublesome text, which may conceal an aggression, but by an open aggressiveness, an overt contempt for appearances. The old style of interpretation was insistent, but respectful. It erected a new meaning on top of the literal one. The modern style of interpretation excavates, and as it excavates, destroys. It digs behind the text to find a subtext which is the true one. The most celebrated and influential modern doctrines of our time, those of Marx and Freud, actually amount to elaborate systems of hermeneutics, aggressive and impious theories of interpretation. All observable phenomena are bracketed, in Freud's phrase, as manifest content. This manifest content must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning, the latent content beneath. For Marx, social events like revolutions and wars. For Freud, the events of individual lives like neurotic symptoms and slips of the tongue, as well as texts like a dream or a work of art. All are treated as occasions for interpretation. According to Marx and Freud, these events only seem to be intelligible. Actually, they have no meaning at all without interpretation. Thus, to understand is to interpret, and to interpret is to restate the phenomenon, in effect, to find an equivalent for it. Thus, interpretation is not, as most people assume, an absolute value, a gesture of mind situated in some timeless realm of capabilities. Interpretation must itself be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. In some cultural contexts, interpretation is a liberating act. It's a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. In other cultural contexts, it is impertinent, cowardly, reactionary, stifling. Today is such a time when the project of interpretation is largely reactionary, stifling. Like the fumes of the automobile and of heavy industry which befoul our urban atmosphere, the effusions of interpretations of art today poisons our sensibilities. In a culture whose already classical dilemma is the hypertrophy of the intellect at the expense of energy and sensory capabilities, interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. Even more. It's the revenge of the intellect upon the world. To interpret is to impoverish, to deplete the world in order to set up a shadow world of meanings. It's to turn the world into this world as if there were any other. The world, our world, is depleted and impoverished enough. Away with all duplicates of it until we can appreciate again, more immediately, what we have. In most modern instances, interpretation amounts to the Philistine refusal to leave the work of art alone. Real art has the capacity to make us nervous. By reducing the work of art to its content and then interpreting that, one tames the work of art. Interpretation makes art manageable, conformable. It doesn't matter whether artists intend or don't intend for their works to be interpreted. Interpretation based on the highly dubious theory that a work of art is composed of items of content violates art. It turns art into an article for use, for an arrangement into a mental scheme of categories. Of course, interpretation does not always prevail. In fact, a great deal of today's art may be understood as motivated by a flight from interpretation. To avoid interpretation, art might become parody, or it might become abstract, or it might become merely decorative, or it might become non-art. What kind of criticism of commentary on the arts is desirable today? From not saying that works of art are ineffable, that they cannot be described or paraphrased, they can be. The question is how. What would criticism look like that would serve the work of art, not usurp its place? Once upon a time, say for Dante, it must have been a creative and a revolutionary move to interpret works of art so that they might be experienced on several levels. Now, it is not. It reinforces the principle of redundancy that is the principal affliction of our modern life. Once upon a time when high art was scarce, it must have been a creative and a revolutionary act to interpret works of art. Now, it is not. What we decidedly do not need is to further assimilate art into thought, or worse yet, art into culture. Transparency is the highest, most liberating value in art and in criticism today. Transparency means experiencing the luminousness of the thing in itself, of things being what they are. Interpretation takes the sensory experience of art for granted and proceeds from there. This cannot be taken for granted now. Think of the sheer multiplication of works of art available to every one of us, superadded to the conflicting tastes and sights and odours of the urban environment that bombard our senses. Ours is a culture based on excess, on overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our senses. The aim of all criticism on art today should be to make works of art, and by analogy, our own experiences, more, rather than less, real to us. We must learn to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. Our task should not be to find the maximum amount of content in a work of art, much less to squeeze more content out of it than is already there. Our task should be to cut back content so that we can see the thing at all. The aim of all criticism should be to show how it is, what it is, even that it is what it is, rather than to try and say what it means. In place of the hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art.